An Epidemic of Stigmatization in Canonical Literature by Chelsea Klingler. Canonical texts command a significant degree of cultural endorsement. They are placed on pillars extolling their sociocultural relevance and celebrated as the finest examples of existential thought. It is through these classic and influential works, from To Kill a Mockingbird to Of Mice and Men, that adolescents play in the sociocultural ideology of America. However, many of these texts have recently come under fire for their unflattering and inaccurate portrayals of a variety of minority populations. Despite this push for fair representation, the dangerously erroneous and pervasive sociocultural literary narrative of substance use disorder persists. Nearly 21 million Americans were living with addiction in 2017, but a mere 10% of these individuals sought treatment. This is largely attributed to the stigmas surrounding substance use disorder that currently dominate the addiction conversation in both literary and social spheres. Owen Cannon explores at length the ways in which popular theology of the past has informed sociocultural attitudes about substance use disorder in the present. Literary writers helped shape this discourse, Cannon asserts, by telling stories of alcoholic decline and redemption that drew special attention to the form's construction of socio-political meaning. What this interaction between literature and religion ultimately produced was the redemptive arc, which set an unrealistic sociocultural precedent that denies the psychological and physiological realities of addiction. In Gozik's exploration of Arthur Miller's post-World War II dramas, the former claims that Miller recognized the potential of addiction to signify moral and physical decline, a potential mobilized by the American temperance movement with its strong tradition of propagandist theater. Miller used addiction to dramatize apathy. Gozik never questions the ethical legitimacy of using substance use disorder to indicate that a character is inherently bad. Paul Marchbanks alludes to the addict as a social construction, while simultaneously drawing connections between substance use disorder and disability in the Bronte sisters' various works. However, Marchbanks ends up promoting the perception of addicts as burdens on both their families and society. He illustrates the ways in which the sisters' representations of disability are a projection of their own sentiments about their brother Branwell, who suffered from substance use disorder. He was weak, the family's commitment to caring for him undeserved. Marchbanks' words suggest a kind of awe that the Brontes felt the obligation to care for their brother at all. This not only echoes the sentiment that addicts are burdens, but that they are unworthy of the care and attention they receive. Like Marchbanks, Patrick Maley takes a less vindictive view of addiction in his analysis of Long Day's Journey into Night. He desperately and naively endeavors to make allowances for Mary's addiction and relapse, but his efforts in diction are misguided. When we consider all that Mary has been through, Maley explains, it becomes difficult to fault her for whatever strategy she chooses to battle her and the family's psychological demons. This is another stigmatizing trope that fallacious literary representations and analysis perpetuate, that addiction is a choice. In actuality, substance, alcohol, and drug dependence is a chronic disease for which many affected adults receive no intervention or detoxification. Like other chronic diseases, ergo diabetes, congestive heart failure, substance dependence has no cure and is characterized by relapses requiring longitudinal care. Unfortunately, the sociocultural narrative surrounding addiction in the United States contradicts this position. This country is currently in the process of riding out a third wave in the seemingly endless heroin epidemic. America is losing a generation to overdose and prejudicial apathy. At present, professional literary analysis is largely dominated from a physically and psychologically normative perspective that either does not recognize or simply ignores the ableist rhetoric and representations surrounding addicts and addiction in classic canonical texts like Eugene O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into Night. The current perception of substance use disorder as a byproduct of moral infirmity has led to the gross marginalization of addicts as a social group. A first step in changing the conversation surrounding substance use disorder is to challenge academic analysis that ignores the stereotyping and stigmatization of individuals with addiction. The American with Disabilities Act defines disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, a person who has a history or record of such an impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. Substance use disorder satisfies all these qualifiers, as evidenced by Mary Tyrone. Mary's appetite is drastically affected by her drug use, so much so that her husband, James Tyrone, makes frequent, and it should be noted unsolicited, remarks about her weight. "You're a fine armful now, Mary," he admonishes, "with those 20 pounds you've gained." 20, suffice it to say, is not an insubstantial number of pounds. This indicates that Mary's ability to satisfy her most basic instinct, the need to eat, is thwarted by her disease. Mary also has a record of relapse, another of ADA's requirements, suggesting a history of impairment. Finally, the men of the Tyrone family regard Mary as having a very serious, life-threatening health issue. While their language may not contain an acknowledgement of an impairment per se, they invariably expect that Mary's condition will deteriorate regardless of her sobriety. Mary Tyrone clearly satisfies all the necessary criteria to qualify as an individual with a disability under the ADA. Even among stigmatized people, says Brown, relative comparisons are made, and people are reassured by the fact that there is someone worse off. This concept refers to the self-stigmatization that is an inherent part of the addiction experience. Projection and denial are the primary means by which the Tyrones express their self-stigmatization. Each Tyrone is eager to point the finger of blame at another while tactfully ignoring the implications those accusations have for their own behavior. Mary is the most obviously entrenched in her denial, clinging to it with a dogged tenacity. She flatly denies her own drug use, but explicitly addresses her husband and son's issues with alcohol use disorder. "I don't know what you're talking about, James," she scolds her husband. "You say such mean, bitter things when you've drunk too much. You're as bad as Jamie or Edmund." Tyrone frequently denies his AUD, claiming, "I never get drunk. I've never missed a performance in my life. That's the proof." While Mary and James Tyrone's youngest son, Edmund, regards his own AUD as something he can control. "I'm on the wagon," he claims, "but tonight doesn't count. Too many damn things have happened today." If these characters in their dialogue are taken out of the disease and disability framework, their admonitions are reduced to a series of weak excuses. However, the excuses mask the symptoms of substance use disorder. It is the nature of the disease that the addict will protect their ability to use by denying their substance use is an issue. This knowledge changes how the reader will interpret the character's motivations. Rather than seeing this behavior as a choice to continue to use, it becomes apparent that neither Mary nor the Tyrone men are in control of their actions. However, they are helpless to engage their disease differently because of the sociocultural conditioning that is causing them to deny the existence of a problem. The oldest son, Jamie, is the only character who is upfront and honest about his substance abuse. He doesn't attempt to downplay the seriousness of his drinking, nor does he make excuses for his excess. What is interesting about this is that both Mary and Tyrone express a blatant dissatisfaction with Jamie that they do not extend to their younger son. "Who would have thought," Mary says, "Jamie would grow up to disgrace us?" James Tyrone's ire is more flagrant. "You're not like your damn tramp of a brother. If he's ever had a loftier dream than whores and whiskeys, he's never shown it." The Tyrones prefer to pretend that substance use disorder does not affect the family as a collective, but Jamie's unapologetic attitude threatens that make-believe narrative. In fact, Jamie's acceptance of his AUD is such a disruption that James Tyrone threatens more than once to have Jamie kicked out in the gutter. This threat of homelessness parallels American society in an interesting way. While individuals with substance use disorder are protected under the ADA, 54% of respondents in a stigma of addiction study agreed that landlords should be allowed to deny housing to persons with drug addiction. The implications of this percentage are staggering and clearly indicate that addicts face an unprecedented amount of discrimination that impacts their ability to function in normate environments. In Long Day's Journey into Night, O'Neill carefully crafts the illusion of addiction as a choice by supplying all the Tyrones with excuses to abuse substances. However, Mary's drug use is the most prominently featured. "Someday," Mary reminisces, "when the Blessed Virgin forgives me, she will believe in me, and with her help, it will be so easy." This is a subliminally damning line that implies Mary is bad, so bad that she has lost celestial favor. Mary's moral failing is the cause of the Virgin's abandonment, but can also only be cured by divine intervention. This has the unfortunate effect of suggesting that Mary is naturally immoral, when it can more likely be attributed to her genetic risk factors. It is evident, based on Mary's familial history with addiction, that a genetic component is at play. Mary's father, according to James Tyrone, never touched a drop of alcohol until he was 40, but that he made up for lost time following that initial inebriation. The fact that Mary's father never had an issue with substance use disorder until later in his life implies a hereditary predisposition to the disease. It is extremely unlikely that her father would have, at the age of 40, suddenly developed a crippling dependence on booze if he were not already biologically inclined to addiction. meaning substance use disorder didn't happen to Mary and she certainly didn't choose it. It was a disease she was born with and appears to have passed on to her sons. However, O'Neill takes this representation of substance use disorder as a combination of poor character and choice a step further with Jamie. While it is true that addiction is a disease, it is not contagious in either the literal or metaphorical sense. Despite this, the prevailing sociocultural stigma regards substance use disorder as catching, ascribing an almost predatory nature to the addict. This is a perception that was both embodied in and exacerbated by the largely ineffective Reagan-era Just Say No campaign and corresponding DARE program. Jamie, in a fit of inebriation, confides in Edmund, "I've been a rotten bad influence, and worst of it is, I did it on purpose. Did it on purpose to make a bum of you, never wanted you to succeed and make me look even worse by comparison." This representation is problematic for multiple reasons. First, this suggests an inherent depravity that delegitimizes Jamie's struggle. Second, addicts do not actively seek to corrupt others. This entire passage reinforces the illogical fear of the faceless other, a socioculturally invented morality boogeyman designed to scare children and justify the persecution of addicts. Through Mary and Jamie, O'Neill embeds a message of addiction as a choice and character deficiency into Long Day's journey into night. Without a disability and disease framework to contextualize their behavior, these characters can only be considered morally corrupt and socially unsalvageable. This idea that addicts cannot be saved is itself a stigma that allows society to condone its apathy toward individuals with substance use disorder, and that Long Day's journey into night perpetuates by presenting recovery in terms of absolute failure. From the play's opening scene, the characters' rhetoric and actions betray the inevitability of Mary's relapse. The men's incessant hovering and thinly veiled insinuations, "But you mustn't let it upset you, Mary. Remember, you've got to take care of yourself, too," betray their lack of faith in both their matriarch and her ability to succeed. It is true that the men occasionally offer interjections that suggest a degree of confidence in her sobriety. However, the authenticity of these assertions is cast into considerable doubt by their more frequently voiced concerns about relapse. Admittedly, Mary is addicted to one of the most toxic of the addictive substances, but success in recovery is possible with adequate support during outpatient care. Unfortunately, at home, Mary is in an environment where she is isolated and cut off from any type of recovery community or genuine social support network. She says to Edmund, "None of you believe in me. If there was only some place I could go to get away for a day, some woman friend I could talk to." Not only do the men of the family not provide an emotionally supportive environment, they actively use in front of her. James, Tyrone, Edmund, and Jamie all continue to indulge their AUD while reminding Mary that it's bad for you to forget. The right way is to remember, so you'll always be on your guard. Placing an addict who is new to recovery in an environment characterized by active substance use is a recipe for failure. This representation of relapse reinforces two very distinct types of stigmatization. The first is that addicts are incurable. The second is that maintaining sobriety is a matter of willpower. To the uninitiated, Mary's relapse is evidence of the latter. There is no pill a doctor can prescribe that will make someone a stronger person. From this perspective, it becomes too easy to dismiss addicts as a lost cause. It needs to be understood, however, that addiction is a chronic disease. This means that substance use disorder physically alters the way the brain functions. Mary has an extremely diminished capacity to resist the urge to use morphine because her brain, to oversimplify the science, has become dependent on that substance. Yet James Tyrone clearly implies that Mary's failure can be attributed to a lack of willpower. "For the love of God, why couldn't you have the strength to keep on?" he says. James Tyrone is clearly implying that Mary is the party at fault. He says "you," indicating his wife and implicating her in her own destruction. The reality of it is that Mary is battling her physiology for every second of sobriety. Her disease has progressed to the point that it is no longer a question of willpower, but rather a matter of denying her body what it desperately thinks it needs to survive. To date, no cure for addiction exists, but it can be managed like any other number of chronic conditions such as heart disease or diabetes. The problem is that society has decided that because there is no cure, that addicts are disposable. Sociocultural stigmas reinforce the perception of addiction as a terminal and self-inflicted condition. It is this attitude that allows society to casually ignore the fact that 130 people die from heroin overdose every day. That means at least 5 people die every hour in America in what has become a socioculturally sanctioned genocide. The real danger of this stigma, when considered in conjunction with addicts' tendency to self-stigmatize, is that it prevents addicts from seeking the life-saving treatments they need. Jamie, upon seeing his mother succumb once more to her substance use disorder, remarks, "I suppose I can't forgive her. Yet. It meant so much. I'd begun to hope if she'd beaten the game, I could too." Despite the fact that O'Neill has written this line without stage direction, Jamie's agony is evident in every word. His hopelessness is profound in its totality. It is in this moment that Jamie accepts his fate as inevitable. He realizes there is no hope of sobriety, which begs the unanswered question, then why bother? What all these elements ultimately produce is a pervasive atmosphere of shame surrounding substance use disorder. Until addiction is elevated from the misconceptions and the mental images of the person who is dying in the gutter or dying in the crack house or heroin shooting gallery, there will always be shame. Even though all of the Tyrones are addicts, Mary and Jamie are unquestionably identified as the primary source of familial shame. Mary herself describes Jamie as a disgrace, and James Tyrone frequently decries his son's more antisocial tendencies. Although Jamie gives as good as he gets, exclaiming, "Never forget the first time I got wise, caught her in the act with a hypo. Christ, I'd never dreamed before that any woman but whores took dope." It is evident from the men's collective reactions to Mary that her addiction is the most mortifying. The fact that the family sequesters her away in the sanitarium to begin with is indicative of their collective embarrassment. Their mortification stemmed from her behavior rather than what the disease is doing to her. "I hope you'll lay in a good stock ahead," James Tyrone says angrily, "so we'll never have another night like the one when you screamed for it and ran out of the house in your nightdress half crazy to try and throw yourself off the dock." James Tyrone should have been concerned about the fact that his wife was in so much pain she couldn't form a coherent thought. Instead, he's preoccupied with her unseemly behavior and state of undress. This degree of stigmatization is particularly detrimental at the secondary level, where canonical texts compose a significant portion of the main curriculum. A comparative analysis found that schools and teachers unintentionally impact adolescents' identity through messages that communicate who they should or can be through differentiation and selection, meaning that educators and educational institutions play a significant role in student identity development. A study of adolescent opioid use found that deaths from heroin overdose among teens is on the rise. If educators read texts like Long Day's Journey into Night without addressing the inherent stigmatization of substance use disorder, they are deliberately marginalizing their students with addiction. It is also important to remember that a student does not necessarily need to have substance use disorder to be affected by it. A 2017 study found that 10% of children, as in 1 in 10, were living with a parent or caregiver with alcohol use disorder. These numbers are dizzying in their significance and further underscore the importance of shifting the dominant sociocultural narrative surrounding addiction. The critical evaluation of how this country views substance use disorder is still in its infancy. It is a conversation that has been compounded and complicated by both addicts and the normative society they inhabit. The black and white mentality that has dominated the sociocultural addiction narrative continues to cost addicts their lives every hour of every day. This epidemic of literary and social animosity has cost mothers their daughters, fathers their sons, and girlfriends their best friends. It's time for society to begin thinking about substance use disorder from another perspective. Maybe it's not black and white. Maybe it's a whole lot of gray.